I'm a corporate attorney at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, and I'd spent my whole career reading contracts. Other people were too lazy or too trusting to read all the way through. 4 months pregnant, sitting in the exam room waiting for my husband to come back from a work call, I got up to use the bathroom and heard him through the cracked door of the consultation room down the hall, talking to my OB in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Make sure the paperwork says natural causes. He said it like he was negotiating a closing date on a house. My father-in-law's company needs a controlling shareholder by spring, and that means a healthy grandson, not a girl. If it's a girl, we lose the firm. I stood frozen with my hand flat against the wall, my heart going so hard I thought it might be audible through the drywall. I wasn't carrying twins. I was carrying one baby, a girl, according to the anatomy scan we'd had 3 weeks earlier. My husband Bennett had cried when the technician told us. Actual tears. I'd believed every one of them. That night I didn't say a word. I went home, made dinner, let him rub my feet on the couch while we watched some forgettable show, and somewhere underneath all of it, the part of my brain that bills $300 an hour to find the lie buried in Clause 14 of a merger agreement quietly opened a file. If you're watching this, drop where you're tuning in from down in the comments, and if you've ever had to outthink someone who was supposed to love you, hit subscribe, because this story is for you. I grew up outside Pittsburgh, the daughter of a steelworker and a woman who kept the family books in a composition notebook because she didn't trust banks after watching her own mother lose everything in the 80s. My mother used to say a contract is just a promise written down so it can't lie to you later. I built a career on that idea. 11 years at Kessler & Voss, specializing in shareholder agreements and succession disputes, the unglamorous side of corporate law where families tear each other apart over who inherits what. I'd spent a decade watching wealthy people destroy each other over money. I never once thought I'd be the one sitting across the table from it. I met Bennett Whitfield at a deposition, of all places. He was the in-house counsel for his father's company, Whitfield Sterling Manufacturing, a third-generation industrial parts business worth somewhere north of $40 million depending on the quarter. He was charming in that practiced way that made juries like him, the kind of charm that's been polished since prep school. We dated for 2 years, married in a vineyard outside Asheville, and I told myself I'd married a partner, not a project. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for another year and a half. Whitfield Sterling had been founded by Bennett's grandfather and was, on paper, still a family company, but the actual control sat with a single clause in the shareholder trust. The company's controlling interest, 51%, would transfer to the first grandchild who was, in the exact and frankly archaic language of the trust, male issue of the Whitfield bloodline upon that grandchild's birth, to be held by the parents until majority. No grandson, no transfer. The company would instead be sold off and the proceeds split among extended cousins who had been circling for years like vultures waiting for an old elm to finally fall. Bennett's father, Harold, was 71 and had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the year before. The clock, as it turned out, was the only thing in this family that everyone agreed was real. I learned all of this slowly, in pieces, over Sunday dinners at Harold's enormous colonial house in Myers Park, where his second wife, Patricia, no, that's not, where Bennett's mother, a woman named Carlotta, who wore her wedding ring like a weapon and her opinions louder than her perfume, ran the table like a courtroom. My sister-in-law Greer had been trying for a baby for 3 years with her husband Holden, a man who did something vague in private equity and had never, as far as I could tell, worked a 40-hour week in his life. Greer had lost 2 pregnancies. I knew that. I'd cried with her over it, genuinely. What I didn't know until that hallway outside the exam room was how desperately the family needed her to have a son, before Harold's hands started shaking too badly to sign anything at all. The dinner 2 nights after I overheard them was supposed to celebrate the ultrasound. I sat at that table and watched the 4 of them, Bennett, Carlotta, Greer, and Holden, pass comments back and forth like a relay race, every one of them circling the same unspoken finish line. A girl, Carlotta said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin, her eyes flicking to Harold at the head of the table. Well, we'll just have to see what the next one brings, won't we? Harold's hand trembled slightly around his wine glass, and not from the Parkinson's. There's no time for a next one, Carlotta, he said quietly, and the table went still for half a second before Bennett jumped in to smooth it over, the way he always did, the way I used to find endearing. Dad, let's not do this tonight, let's just enjoy the good news. Good news. I sat there with my hand resting on my stomach, smiling the smile I'd practiced in the bathroom mirror that morning, and thought about the word natural causes sitting in my husband's mouth like it belonged there. After dinner, Greer cornered me in the kitchen while I was rinsing a serving dish, and for one disorienting second she looked almost sorry. "You know this isn't easy for any of us," she said. "Holden's been under so much pressure from his investors. If the trust doesn't transfer by the time Harold's incapacitated, the lawyers say the whole estate goes into receivership. We'd lose everything we've built." "What does that have to do with my pregnancy?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even, the voice I used in depositions when I wanted a witness to keep talking. She looked at me a beat too long. "Nothing," she said. "Forget I said anything. I didn't forget. I never forget anything. That's the job. I want to tell you that I confronted him that night, threw a vase, demanded answers. That's not what happened. What happened is I went home and I became, for the next several weeks, the single most attentive, agreeable, docile, pregnant wife Bennett Whitfield had ever seen. I let him pick the nursery colors. I let him talk over me at dinner. I let Carlotta plan a baby shower I didn't want. And every night, after he fell asleep, and Bennett slept like a man with nothing on his conscience, which told me everything about how long he'd been planning this, I went down to his study and got to work. I'd watched him type his laptop password enough times over 2 years to have it memorized without ever meaning to. People think lawyers are good at lying. We're actually just very good at remembering the truth, including other people's. I sat in his leather chair at 1 in the morning and opened his email, and within 20 minutes I found a thread between Bennett and a man named Doctor Castellano, a high-risk OB who ran a private boutique practice 2 counties over. Not the same doctor I'd overheard him with at the hospital, but a second one, someone Bennett had clearly been keeping in reserve. The emails were clinical and cold in a way that made my skin crawl. Castellano was being paid a consulting retainer of $200,000, wired through a shell entity called Meridian Family Health Advisors, which existed, as far as I could tell from a 20-minute search of Delaware's business registry, purely on paper. The retainer wasn't for medical advice. It was for silence and for a contingency plan. If the baby was confirmed female and Greer's surrogacy attempt, because that's what it was, I learned that night, a gestational surrogate Greer and Holden had quietly retained 8 months earlier, using a donor egg and Holden's sperm, a pregnancy that had also, devastatingly, resulted in a girl. If both pregnancies produced daughters, Bennett's plan was to falsify a stillbirth at delivery, smuggle the healthy infant to a private clinic, and have Castellano process the transfer to Greer and Holden under a fabricated adoption record, while I was told my daughter hadn't survived. I sat in that chair until almost 4 in the morning, reading through 18 months of buried correspondence, and somewhere around email 40, I stopped being a wife discovering a betrayal and became, instead, exactly what I'd been trained to be for 11 years, an attorney building a file. I downloaded everything to an encrypted drive. I screenshotted headers and metadata so nothing could later be dismissed as doctored. I made a timeline. By sunrise, I had the bones of a case that would make a federal prosecutor's whole year. What I didn't have yet was proof that Carlotta and Harold knew, and proof that this wasn't theoretical, that there was an actual plan in motion with a date. The following Tuesday, Bennett came home with a thick stack of papers in a plain envelope, the kind of envelope designed to look boring on purpose. "Castellano wants you to start at his practice for the rest of the pregnancy," he said, setting it on the kitchen counter like it was nothing. "Better facility, better outcomes for high-risk twins. High-risk pregnancies, sorry. Just sign the intake form so they can get you on the schedule." I noticed the slip. Twins. We weren't having twins. He caught himself fast, but 11 years of depositions had trained me to hear exactly that kind of slip, the kind people make when they're juggling 2 stories in their head and the wrong one surfaces for half a second. I read every page of that stack at the kitchen table while he hovered, checking his watch, telling me Castellano needed it back by end of day. Page after page of standard consent forms, and then, buried on page 14, a clause labeled postpartum contingency authorization, written in dense, deliberately exhausting legal language that anyone but a contracts attorney would have skimmed past. Stripped of the jargon, it authorized the clinic, in the event of adverse neonatal outcome, to handle disposition of remains without an independent medical review, and granted temporary medical power of attorney, in the event I was deemed postpartum incapacitated, to the next listed kin. The name typed into that blank wasn't my mother's, it was Carlotta's. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. the way it does right before you stand up in a courtroom and say something that's going to change the whole room. I signed the cover page. I did not sign page 14. Instead, I told Bennett I'd spilled water on it reaching for my glass, and the ink had run, and I'd need a fresh copy. He believed me because Bennett had never once, in 2 years, seen me as someone capable of strategy. That was always his mistake. He thought he'd married someone soft. That night, I called my college roommate's husband, a former Charlotte Mecklenburg detective named Marcus Doyle, who now ran a small private investigations firm out of a strip mall near the airport, and I told him I needed surveillance on 2 addresses starting immediately, off the books, cash only, and that I needed it done quietly because the people I was watching had money and lawyers and a 71-year-old patriarch who could make problems disappear with a phone call. "Whose addresses?" he asked. "My sister-in-law and her husband," I said. "I think they're about to buy my daughter." Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Send me everything you've got." What came back over the next 10 days confirmed every fear I had and introduced a few new ones. Photos of a nursery being assembled in Greer and Holden's house, painted a soft blush pink. They'd known the surrogate's baby was a girl for weeks, but they were preparing for the possibility of swapping in mine instead. The one with the Whitfield bloodline, the one that would actually unlock the trust the moment Harold confirmed paternity through a quiet private DNA test Bennett had already arranged with Castellano's office. A boy, it turned out, wasn't actually required by the literal trust language. Bennett had been lying to me about that detail too. The male issue clause had been amended 11 years ago to lineal descendant, but Bennett needed me to believe a son was required, because it gave him an excuse for the elaborate switch. The real plan was simpler and uglier than I'd first understood. They didn't need a boy. They needed Greer to be the one holding a Whitfield baby. Any Whitfield baby. Because Harold, dying and desperate to see the company stay in blood hands, had quietly decided he trusted Greer's judgment over mine, a woman he'd always treated as an outsider who'd married in. If my daughter were lost and Greer suddenly had a healthy infant with Whitfield blood, nobody would ever question it, and the trust would transfer to a child I would never know was actually mine. Marcus also caught audio. He'd planted a recorder in a gift basket delivered to Greer's front porch. Long story, the man was resourceful. And 2 days before my due date, it picked up Holden on the phone with Castellano's office manager, confirming a delivery date of the 18th and the wire of the final payment, $350,000, routed the same way as the first. I had the emails. I had the financial trail. I had the forged consent form. I had audio of the buyer confirming the transaction. What I needed now was to survive the actual day. Carlotta moved into our guest room 9 days before my due date. "To help," she said, the same performance Brenda from the earlier story might have given, except Carlotta did it with the cool efficiency of a woman who'd clearly done this kind of thing, managed a difficult situation before. She took over my prenatal vitamins, replacing my pharmacy bottle with a different one she said Castellano had specially formulated for my blood pressure. I didn't take a single one. I flushed them and refilled the bottle with plain calcium chews from the drugstore, identical in size and color, and smiled and thanked her every single morning like she was doing me a favor. I had Marcus run a rapid field test on the original pills 2 nights later, sitting in his truck outside a Waffle House at 11 p.m., like something out of a movie I never expected to star in. They came back positive for a compounded dose of misoprostol, enough to push my body into early labor on a schedule that wasn't mine. I sat in that truck and felt something shift permanently in my chest. This wasn't a family making a hard choice under pressure anymore. This was attempted poisoning of a pregnant woman by her own mother-in-law, and I had it documented down to the chemical compound. I called Special Agent Renata Cho the next morning. I'd worked alongside the FBI's white-collar division twice in my career on fraud cases, and Renata was sharp and fast and didn't waste time asking questions that didn't matter. I sent her the entire file. By the end of that call, she told me a joint task force, FBI and the State Medical Board, since Castellano's license history turned out to have one prior quiet settlement involving a different falsified stillbirth 7 years earlier, a pattern, exactly the kind of pattern that makes federal prosecutors very happy, would be ready to move the moment I gave the word. "You'll need to actually go into labor near him for us to catch the exchange in progress," Renata said. "Are you safe doing that?" I thought about my daughter, about the rocking chair Bennett had built with his own hands in the nursery, a detail that almost made me doubt myself, almost before I remembered the word natural causes. "I'll be safe," I told her. "I've been planning this longer than they have." 3 nights later, Bennett and I were watching television in the den when I let out a sound I'd practiced in my head a dozen times, doubled over, gripping the arm of the couch. He was at my side instantly, and for 1/2 second I watched something genuine cross his face, real fear, and it almost undid me, because some small idiot part of me still wanted to believe he loved me even while he was selling our daughter. Then he asked, voice tight, "It's not the 18th yet. Is this real? Not is the baby okay? Not are you okay?" A date. Something's wrong, I gasped, and it wasn't entirely an act anymore because the pressure low in my abdomen had genuinely started to feel like a performance and more like the real thing. "Call 911. We're not doing that," he said, and his whole face changed, the charm sliding off like a coat. "Castellano's 2 minutes from here, we're going to him." He half carried me to the car while I cried real tears, partly from pain and partly, I'll admit it, from grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. He drove fast, knuckles white on the wheel, dialing Castellano with one hand. "She's early," he said into the phone. "I don't care, get the room ready, we're coming now." A pause. "No, Carlotta's already calling Greer." I texted Renata from inside my coat pocket without looking down, 3 words we'd agreed on in advance. "He's moved up." Castellano's private clinic looked, from the outside, like a converted Victorian house in a quiet medical district. Nothing about it suggesting what was happening inside. Bennett walked me in through a side entrance instead of the front, which told me everything about how rehearsed this was. A nurse I didn't recognize got me onto a gurney fast, too fast, the kind of fast that comes from practice, not concern, and wheeled me into a private room where Castellano was already waiting in scrubs, calm in a way no real doctor is calm about an unplanned early labor. "We'll get you something to help you relax," he said, reaching for a syringe on the tray, and I knew the way I'd known in that exam room hallway months earlier, that if that needle went into my arm I would wake up hours later and be told a story I would have no way to disprove. "No," I said, and I made my voice loud, lawyer loud, the voice I use when opposing counsel tries to slip something past a judge. "I am not consenting to sedation, I want this on record." Castellano's calm face flickered. "You're in active labor, you're not in a position to." "I am in a perfectly legal position to refuse medical treatment," I said. "And you are not my treating physician of record, you are not credentialed at any hospital in this state. And if that needle comes near me, I will make sure every regulatory board in North Carolina knows your name by morning." Bennett grabbed my wrist, not gently, the bruising kind of not gently, and said my name in a warning tone I'd never heard from him before. And that was the exact moment the front door of the clinic came off its hinges. I'd never actually seen a federal raid happen. I'd read about plenty in case files over the years, all clinical language, agents executed a warrant, nothing about the actual sound of it, the shouting, the sheer number of bodies in tactical vests filling a hallway built for 2 people at a time. Renata came through first, badge up, and 4 agents fanned out behind her with their weapons lowered but ready, and somewhere down the hall I heard Carlotta's voice rise into something I'd never heard from her either. Pure, undignified panic. "FBI, hands where we can see them," one agent said to Castellano, who actually dropped the syringe and it shattered on the tile, and some petty, exhausted part of me felt a satisfaction so deep it scared me a little. Bennett's hands went up automatically, the reflex of a man who'd clearly never once imagined this specific outcome. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, to no one in particular, the same line every guilty man says. "Mr. Whitfield," Renata said, stepping in close, "we have the wire transfers to Meridian Family Health Advisors. We have the falsified consent authorization with your wife's forged intent. We have surveillance confirming purchase of an infant nursery at the home of Holden and Greer Ashworth Whitfield prior to any legitimate birth, and we have an audio recording of your associate confirming a delivery date for an exchange of currency for a child. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, fraud, and falsification of medical records." Through the open doorway I could see down the hall, where 2 more agents had Greer pinned gently against the reception desk, her face white, and Carlotta sitting in a plastic chair with her hands cuffed in her lap, finally, without a single word to say. The contractions didn't stop for the chaos. Real medics, Renata had them staged a block away, waiting exactly for this, came through within minutes and got me onto a proper gurney, and as they wheeled me out past Bennett, who was being walked toward an unmarked car with his wrists zip-tied behind him, I made myself stop and look at him. "You told Castellano to write natural causes," I said. "I heard you. 4 months ago in that hallway. Every single thing after that was just me proving it." He didn't say anything, there was nothing left in his face to say it with. I gave birth 9 hours later at a real hospital downtown, with my own mother holding one hand and Marcus, of all people, sitting awkwardly in the waiting room because he said he wasn't leaving until he saw the file close properly. My daughter was born healthy, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and when they put her on my chest, the first thing I thought, embarrassingly, was a legal one. Nobody is ever taking this kid's name off a birth certificate that isn't mine. The federal case moved fast once the wire fraud crossed state lines, which it had. Meridian's accounts ran through a bank in Georgia. Bennett pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud rather than risk trial, and is currently 4 years into a 9-year federal sentence. Whitfield Sterling Manufacturing was placed into receivership during the investigation and ultimately sold to a competitor, the proceeds frozen pending restitution to me as part of the divorce settlement which my own firm, awkwardly and gratifyingly, handled pro bono. Castellano lost his license permanently and is awaiting trial on multiple counts, including the older case from 7 years back that the investigation reopened. Carlotta took a plea deal for accessory and attempted poisoning and is serving 18 months. Greer was never criminally charged. There wasn't enough to prove she knew the full scope, only that she was a desperate, willing buyer in a scheme she didn't build. But she lost her marriage when Holden's name came out in the press, and lost what was left of her relationship with me long before that. I live now in a townhouse in South End with a yard just big enough for a swing set, and I made partner at my firm last spring, the youngest in the office's history, on the strength of, among other things, a reputation I never asked for as the lawyer who built her own federal indictment from a hospital hallway. My daughter is 2 now, loud and stubborn and utterly unaware of how close she came to growing up under someone else's name. Some nights, rocking her in that chair Bennett built before any of this started, I think about how he made it with real care, real hands, and how love and betrayal apparently fit in the same body without either one canceling the other out. I don't think about that for very long anymore. If anyone ever tells you that you're too sensitive, too paranoid, too suspicious for noticing the thing that doesn't add up, trust that instinct anyway. The people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the very ones you have to build a case against, and you don't need anyone's permission to start collecting the evidence. I built mine one sleepless night at a time, and it was enough to bring down an entire family. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to fight for something no one believed you about, and if this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. There are more like it here.